Good mythical afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mr. A with your next vlog. This is 10-2, Jackson's policy towards Native Americans. As always, please make sure you're listening and that you're reviewing this vlog or Edpuzzle or however it's used as this year to help you out. So, let's look at our objectives. You'll be able to explain why the Cherokee Nation and tribe are known as one of the 5 civilized tribes. You'll be able to explain the court case and issues surrounding Cherokee v. Georgia. And you'll be able to analyze the causes, consequences, and effects of the Native American Removal Act. So, we do know that the Native Americans were all over North and South America prior to European colonization. And in particular, since the 1600s, white settlers in the South were taking Native American land to increase the size of their plantations, including their cotton holdings. So, a lot of the whites in the South at this time believed that the Native Americans were uncivilized, and they needed the European background, they needed the European civilization to become like the rest of the world, to become civilized. Though this does, in modern time, give us this concept of Eurocentrism, the idea that your ethnicity or your race is better than others. So this whole idea of Native Americans being considered uncivilized is a little bit of a weird one for modern thinkers. So if we look at the areas, if you notice, we have Native Americans all over the place: Iroquois, upstate New York, the Seminoles, Choctaw, the Cherokee, the Shawnee, Apache, the Pawnee, the Sioux, the Blackfoot, Cheyenne, Navajo, Zuni, Hopi, etc., etc., all over the place. So the Cherokee Nation was considered one of the 5 civilized tribes at this time. And it's because they had people like Sequoia, spelled S-E-Q-U-O-Y-A, who adopted white customs. Things like a written language, their own newspaper. They even had their own constitution, and even some of them had their own slaves. So the Cherokee were more or less like the white man. They dressed like them. They had their own written language, and their own newspaper, their own way to govern. But the thing is the settlers in the area wanted the Cherokees' lands because those Cherokee land had gold, they had some iron, and actually some very good fertile soil for cotton. So the national government decided that they're going to respond to this conflict by removing all the Native American nations that are east of the Mississippi River to what we call the Indian Territory, which becomes later Oklahoma. And this is a major problem because there's a lot of treaties prior to this that said that the Native Americans could keep their land. But Andrew Jackson thought this would be a good idea because it would protect them, with quotes in the air. So Jackson supported this idea, this concept of removing all the Native Americans that were east of the Mississippi to the west of the Mississippi to an Indian territory where they could live. So they believed that the government had the right to regulate where the Native Americans lived. And his big concept or big thought on this was that Native Americans were seen as a conquered people. And when you conquer a group of people, you can more or less do as you see fit. So we see this happen with the Mongols when they would move people around. We saw this with the Soviet Union when they moved people around, the British Empire, all these various places. So Jackson just wanted to keep doing what every nation prior has already done. So Andrew Jackson more or less gives the Native Americans 2 choices. One, they need to adopt white culture and integrate into the American way and become a U.S. citizen, or they need to move into a Western territory, like the Indian Territory, which becomes Oklahoma later, but have no right to their own government. So this was going to be a not very pleasant experience for either side. So after weeks of debate, Congress ends up passing in 1830 the Indian Removal Act. And what this says that all Native American tribes east of the Mississippi are to sign treaties with the government to hand over their land, and in turn, they will get their own land in Indian Territory in the West that they can have for themselves. But this became a major issue because, I mean, if you think about the Seminoles, they lived in swamps, and they're going to Oklahoma, which is a more or less a desert. So when you're moving people out of their geography that they're used to, their home life, their way of life is going to disappear. But Jackson immediately began to enforce and execute the law. Because remember, he's the president, he's in charge of the executive branch. His job is to enforce these laws. And Jackson thought he was being just because he's like, these are conquered people. If I move them out of the way of the white man, they're more likely to be safe and be able to keep their own way of life. But this actually ends up becoming one of the worst parts of American history because a lot of various countries and even people in the U.S. believe that Jackson committed genocide to the Native Americans because he moved them and lots of them died during these marches. So if you notice, for example, in 1832, we have all these different Native Americans, mostly in the 1830s, moving to the Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma and part of Kansas and Nebraska. The Sac and the Fox, the Cherokee, Choctaw, the Chickasaw, Creek, the Seminoles, all of them are being forced to be moved out of their area. So, we end up getting to what we call the Trail of Tears. So because of the Indian Removal Act, a lot of white settlers decided that they were going to start invading and taking the Native American lands even before they were removed. So the Cherokee actually ended up taking the United States government to court in Cherokee v. Georgia. So the Supreme Court said that since the Cherokee were a sovereign nation, they had control of their own land, they had their own government. They did not have to listen to the states or the nation's laws because they're their own nation. So Jackson, excuse me, in turn, I do apologize about that. Anyway, so the Supreme Court stated that Cherokee were their own sovereign nation, and the state of Georgia and the United States itself did not have the right to move them out of their area because of treaties that were signed earlier. Jackson ends up responding to the Supreme Court. Well, Marshall made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Because remember, the judicial branch is in charge of saying what's constitutional or what is not through their power of judicial review. And while Jackson's thing is to, since he's the head of the executive branch, is to enforce those laws and to do what the other branches tell him to. And Jackson just completely ignores the Supreme Court. This is the only time in U.S. history that this will actually occur. So most Cherokee actually end up deciding not to leave, and Jackson brings in all these troops under General Winfield Scott to try to remove him. Well, the Cherokee were led by this guy over here named John Ross. So if you notice, John Ross looks like the most ordinary American during this time period, while Jackson and his supporters were like, no, they're a different race, remove them. So during the fall and winter of 1838 to 1839, we ended up having soldiers dragging out the Cherokees from their home and forcing them to march during the winter with only the clothes on the back to their Indian territory. About 20 to 25% of the Cherokee will die during this march, and it was known as the Trail of Tears. What's kind of interesting is Jackson actually left money to try to support these marches and actually give them food and shelter on the way. But because of some of the corruption in the military, they actually ended up taking that for themselves. So Jackson was like, I didn't mean for them all to die, but they did. So this is why that issue of the Trail of Tears and the Native Removal Act being genocide is very up in the air, because some people are like, well, genocide means that you try to do it on purpose. Other people believe genocide is something that can accidentally happen. Other people are like, we didn't try to kill them, it just kind of happened. So we get multiple types of Native American resistance. So we had the Cherokee who sued in court. We had some who just didn't leave, like the Seminoles, and some who would also fight, like the Seminoles. The Seminoles are led by Ayala, and they ended up hiding in the Everglades, and they used guerrilla tactics to fight. So this is just like how during the Revolutionary War, we would hide in trees, take pop shots, run away when we were attacking the British. The Seminoles did the exact same thing to the American troops in Florida. And so we call this the Second Seminole War. It ends in 1842. And this is one of the reasons that the state of Florida and its citizens have a very high respect for the Native American tribes that lived in this area, because no matter what occurred, they kept fighting back. They kept fighting back. And it's really kind of interesting to me to see the respect that we have for them here in the state of Florida. Well, the Sauk, the chief known as Blackhawk, also fights back. This is known as the Blackhawk War, and it's crushed by the Illinois militia and the army. So you have two major Native American groups still fighting. And as always, don't forget to be awesome.